You're listening to episode 64 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Our friend Dr. Glenn Wallis is back to talk with us today about his new book, Buddhavacana, a Pali Reader, and the issue translators face making meaningful sense out of ancient texts. One of the most perplexing tasks a human being can attempt, at least for those of us who are linguistically challenged, is to translate an ancient text. Not only do you have to have a grasp of the vocabulary and grammar, but the subtle shades of meaning, cultural references, and even a sense of when the author is being less than direct. In Buddhism, this becomes even more complex. It's not a laundry list, it's not an accounting journal, it's volumes and volumes of already very deep material on the workings of the mind in a dead language. Fortunately for us monoglots, there are people ready for that intricate and difficult work. Over the past decade, Glenn Wallis has taught in the religion departments of several universities, including the University of Georgia, where he received tenure, Brown University, Bowdoin College, and the Rhode Island School of Design. Glenn began formal Buddhist practice in 1975, and subsequently received training in several forms of Buddhist meditation, including Vipassana, Soto Zen, and traditional Theravada. Currently, he is Associate Professor and Chair of the Applied Meditation Studies Program at the Wan Institute of Graduate Studies. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice jade oolong. Today we are here with our friend Glenn Wallis, who is coming back to us. Glenn, thanks so much for being here again.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
Glad to. To remind the audience, Glenn spoke with us before in episode 40 on the problem with beliefs, and I have a link on the website for the Secular Buddhist on blogs of interest, and I check those out on a pretty regular basis. And his blog, Ovenbird, I noticed that there was a posting recently on a book that, Glenn, you'd mentioned that you were working on and was coming out soon, and I was like, ooh, I gotta see that, let me know when that comes out. And It's out now, so we're going to be speaking with your book, Buddhavacana, a Pali Reader. Tell me about the book, what the format is.
Well, it is a reader. It has 16 suttas, and I can explain in a moment what suttas they are and why. So it has a sutta, and then it has some blank pages on, like a page of sutta, in Pali, in Roman script, and then the facing pages where you can write notes and write your translation. Then at the end of each sutta, there's a glossary just for that sutta with every single word that comes up in the sutta, so that you can easily look at the word. It does presuppose that you have a grammar. I don't explain the grammar here. I give the roots and the stem forms of the word. So you need to work with the grammar. But it's really, and then at the very back I have translations of each sutta, so you can kind of look to those to help you out a little bit. In the beginning I have a pretty extensive introduction, which I think we can talk about in a moment, that explains some of the morphology and syntax and so forth of Pali. But it's supposed to be very user-friendly and really allow for for people to start dipping into some of the text. And let me just say very quickly, I was very happy when the people of Pariyatti asked me to use the same 16 texts, 16 sutras that I translated in Basic Teachings of the Buddha. So it's a little bit like a companion volume to that. So in that volume, I give just translations and then commentary. And in this one, in a way, it's kind of a step back or a deeper level, underlying level, where I give the Pali and the actual lexicon of the Pali texts.
And I know it's nice to see this companion piece for a couple of reasons. First, I do know of some centers that are using your other book as part of their teaching program. And this is Basic Teachings of the Buddha, and that's on the website for folks who want to check that out. And you use a set of 16 suttas which cover a very wide breadth, not just of the specific teachings, but one of the things I like best about that, and again in the new book I noticed this with the very first sutta, you take some of the suttas that I personally at least find some of the most inspiring and riveting, and they're the stories that really enrich the background of what this teaching is. They're fun reads to me, so it was really nice to see those. And Pali's always been tricky for those of us who are missing grapefruit-sized parts of our brain where other languages should live. So it's nice to see that there's help with this. And I want you to tell us some about how you chose those specific suttas for both books, and some of the challenges that the translators face. And I think that's where the bulk of our discussion will lie.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking around for a copy of Basic Teachings. I don't have it here, but the reason I selected those sutras was I created this structure. I was trying to figure out a way to, in a very condensed form, present what I interpret as the basic teachings of the Buddha. So I kind of figured out, I went through this, I said, what are the premises and the presuppositions and the claims being made by the Buddha? And I wrote those out. I wrote 16 of them. And I try to put them sequentially. I don't know if you have a copy at hand. I'd have to run up and get one. But then I said, now let me find suttas that illuminate these premises. So that's how I structured the basic teaching. So it's an argument really saying this is the basic structure of Buddhist teaching, and these are the suttas or the dialogues that illustrate or illuminate this structure. And you're right to ask the question about difficulties of translation, because when you start translating this stuff, you start realizing just how incredibly interpretive that practice is. And that's I'm writing this piece for Buddha Dharma right now, where I'm addressing just that issue. I was explaining that I remembered when the first time I started recognizing Buddhist words in the Devanagari script, the ancient Indian script, the words. I remember seeing the word bhikkhu and making that out. And bhikkhu, I know that word. Wow, there it is. It's like seeing a famous person face to face. God, it looks so different in person, in the flesh. Bhikkhu looks really different in the context of a Buddhist text in Devanagari. And then I opened up the dictionary and it said the usual things I expected, a mendicant, a monk, a priest. But then it said from the root word bhiksh, which means to beg. And then I started thinking, why isn't it translated as beggar? Why is it translated as monk? I mean, come to think of it, they didn't even have monasteries yet. So why is it called a monk or a priest? And then, so from the very beginning, when I was engaging the original text, that's why I called this blog post the bracing rush of the source. I plunged into the dark waters of original language. All these questions emerged. Like, why do we say this? Why do we translate that? What would it mean to start hearing the Buddha call these followers beggars or bums? What would that mean? And then we'd have to say, is he being affectionate or ironic or, cruel? But it has the Buddha speaking a different, sounding different than English from when the Buddha says, "Oh, mendicants," or something like that.
Well, it adds dimension and color to otherwise very flat, black and white terms.
Well, that's another thing that prompted me to do this Pali Reader was that when and maybe many of your listeners will have a similar experience. When I first started reading about Buddhism in the early mid 70s, the language was like the Wild West, like Alan Watt and D.T. Suzuki and Mascaro. They were using this very idiosyncratic kind of language where the teachings almost seemed different depending on whose translations you were reading. But I think recently, that's changed in the last few years, where the language is, in reading Buddhism, the blogs, the magazines, books. When I go to Barnes and Noble and go to the Buddhism section, there's something about the experience of reading that's a little disturbing. And as I say in the blog post, I think it has something to do with the uniformity. That the language has become, it seems to me, very uniform, very kind of conformist. You get these terms that just keep repeating, and kind of it seems to have lost a certain freshness. And part of my interest is to encourage people to be a little sort of self-conscious or self-reflective about how they're making Buddhism speak in English, and also to be careful not to foreclose on the project too quickly, not to decide it too quickly that this is what term X means. Or
yeah, you describe this a bit in the blog post. You say, whether I'm flipping through one of the Buddhist glossy magazines, browsing in the local bookstore, studying a scholarly article, or conversing with a Buddhist, I come away with the same queasy feeling. I can't say that I've really identified the source of this feeling, but I think it stems from the language itself. And you go on to say, a mere century or so into the dissemination throughout American letters, and Gautama's teachings, wild and revolutionary at heart, have been badgered into a linguistic straitjacket.
That's right. That's exactly kind of my experience of reading this stuff. And when you read it in Pali, and you don't have these the English language kind of hovering over you, you have more of that sense of that wild and revolutionary aspect of it. There's a lot of very strange language, a lot of strange things being said in Pali. A lot of the Buddhas seem to have been very, very good at playing with language, and there's a lot in there that he's taken a lot of Brahmanical terms and turning them on their heads, or giving them, like taking these Brahmanical vessels and pouring a completely different wine into them. And he's doing things that I think when you turn them into English, they become serious and staid, but in Pali, they sound like they might even be parodies or jokes. And more and more I see this happening in our books, is like we're fixing the language in a way that is really just a little bit disturbing to me. And part of the reason of the reader is maybe start creating this type of practitioner who has some, and don't want to create like sutta thumpers or anything. but people who have, I certainly don't want to do that. I think I say in posts or in something I'm writing, I'm both wary and weary of this. In this other thing I'm writing of the sutta thumpers. But at least people with a little, were able to make that move and say, so you're saying loving kindness here. That strikes me as kind of a Christian notion. Let me look at my Pali stuff, and let me look at stuff in context, and look at my lexicon, and let me make a decision about whether I'm going to accept loving kindness as a viable translation of metta. And of course, you do that work, you find out loving kindness is from the King James Bible. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the Buddha's teachings. It's a funny decision that someone made in the 19th century, and it got fixed, like Four Noble Truths. And it'd be nice to have some people able to work with the language a little bit, just to kind of keep it open and fresh, not rely on the English too much.
Well, as I recall, words, just like the word for feeling, we now see that as the positive, negative, neutral, Vedana.
Right. Yeah.
And yet, as I recall, one of the early English translations of it was emotion, which you were seeing it in context. Really, how could that even be considered as the translation for this? Because it doesn't capture it at all. And I don't recall where that was, but
I've seen it translated as emotion. I've seen words translated in things like sin or depravities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like really, there's some language that like emotions, an example where it's almost transparently, it's coming out of some other kind of teaching, like psychology or something.
Right.
Sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And a lot of the language is obviously colored by Christian beliefs. Loving kindness is a subtle example, but sin and evil are really big examples of that. You're right. It's ironic. See, that's exactly one of the points I'm making, is that there is no notion of emotion in these teachings. If you start looking at the text, there's something else being said about the nature of feeling or sensation. I'll start forming thoughts around that, and that might give us something that maybe we could say is something like the English or the Western idea of an emotion. But you start adding these up. I mean, there's like each one's very little, but it starts creating a little wobble in the thing.
Right, you're very far off, and I would always see those as mind states is the really kind of the similar to the idea they're getting to, that you have a mind state plus physical sensations and all the usual component parts operating together as a process. The word emotion doesn't quite cover that. No,
it doesn't, and that's the irony is that we're saying these things in the name of a teaching, and then saying them in the way we do, we're veering away from that teaching. And there's no guarantee that the teachings are so great or so valuable or useful, but if we're exploring those teachings, we should at least try to stay in their vicinity, right?
Right.
And then we can make decisions about whether they're valuable teachings or not. I mean,
now, you state in the preface of the book, which is also, you've reproduced that on the blog post, that the reader has 3 related goals. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, the first goal is to encourage the study of the canonical literature. Like I said, maybe some practitioners in America will take it on themselves to want to look at some of the canonical literature, and they learn the language, they'll be able to do that. I think one of the points I make in the preface is that the teachings are changing all the time, and they will continue to change. It might be valuable to at least know from what it is we're changing things, and that's maybe a more responsible way of changing, update and clarify these old teachings. We have to know what it is that's there in the first place. The second goal was, like we spoke about before, was to provide some sort of an overview of the basic teachings. That's why I was happy that I could use the 16 suttas that I used in basic teachings. And the third goal is to help create, as I put it in the preface, help create critics of Buddhism as it begins to take root in the West. I wrote here, and just between you and me, but I guess it'll be between others now. Originally, the editors were uncomfortable with this statement here.
Yeah, I can see why, but you mean critic not in the way we conventionally think of it.
Right, I said our word critic comes from the Greek term for someone who discerns and judges with care. And that's what I mean by a critic, is someone who probes, who asks hard questions of a tradition. If you care about something, you're gonna take a good hard look at it. You're not going to shy away from things that look askew to you because you care. This is becoming critical. I wrote, being such a practitioner, a critical one, takes effort. It requires us to know the facts about our shared tradition and be able to distinguish the teachings from the countless changes, additions, subtractions, etc., that history has brought to bear, and that part of being a critic is being able to again, I don't expect people to go out and become fluent in these languages or something. It just takes too much time and effort. But to be able to work, be able to use it to open up, look at a Pali text, open up a dictionary and a grammar, and start making some sense of it, making some distance for him or herself.
Yeah, and I like that you do describe in particular your use of critic, because the two things that came up for me in reading that section of your article is that we can use the word critic when we associate it with something like critical thinking, and then people go, yeah, that's a good thing. Typically. Right. I believe, I could be wrong in that, but my impression of critical thinking as a phrase is a positive one. And we don't have that same sort of thing when the word critic, when you initially put it in here, which is why I imagine the folks at Pariyati may have been a little twitchy, is not as positive. And we have that same thing, that same impression with the word skeptic, that people associate that with cynic, not just because they sound alike, but because we're used to the idea of a skeptic as being a curmudgeonly old person who won't be convinced of anything about what, which is not at all what skepticism is about. And that's one of the challenges that we face. And I see even authors that you and I are very much admire and listen to them when they speak, and we really like what they have to say, use the word skeptic in that negative kind of that's a bad thing way, and it's understanding that we won't always agree 100% with our favorite authors and our favorite people to listen to. Sometimes it's very challenging to not say, hey, by the way, that's not quite what it means, and it can really be a positive, beneficial thing, particularly within the context of what you're talking about, which is for people to not always just accept what we are handed as, in this case, a translation. You speak a bit about mindfulness and wanting to put a moratorium on that as a translation. Just tell us a little bit about that in particular, because I know that's a word we typically say, sati, mindfulness, or
right.
And there's more to it than that.
I'll come to that one second. I agree with what you said about it. It is unfortunate that we see terms like skepticism and critical as somehow negative. I encounter that every day. I really agree with you, and it's another term I came across recently. I'll just throw this out there for your listeners. It's an older article by a guy named Paul Griffiths. It's actually called, when I first read the title, it took me back. I don't remember the title exactly, but it's something like about rehabilitating polemicism. I thought, what's he talking about? But his argument was that he's writing from he's a Catholic scholar of Catholicism. He used to be a Buddhist studies scholar, Paul Griffiths. There's some really good stuff on Buddhism. But he's arguing that something is being lost in this American Catholicism, which is this that was there in older days when they had a robust tradition of polemicism. Again, a word like skepticism or criticism has negative connotations, but he's saying we need to rehabilitate the term and the practice, because it is what it is people taking responsible positions and arguing from those positions. And he says he sees too little of that happening, but I really agree with that being critical and skeptical are good for dialogue.
Right.
Investigation.
Well, we can have meaningful and forward-moving dialogues where we challenge each other and ourselves. That's okay. That's how we peel away things that are not helpful and make whatever the particular thing we're talking about stronger in view. If things can't withstand that, then there's a problem that we should get at.
That's exactly it. Is if you're talking with people who won't allow criticism or skepticism, like what is it that can't withhold this kind of questioning? Is there some belief here that you're afraid will be exposed through kind of critical questioning? I think too, it's like I tell people when I give talks, a lot of times I'll say at the end of the talk, it's like, everything I said today is like, don't take it too seriously, because I change my views day by day, week by week. You hear me talk on this topic a month from now, I might say something completely different.
Yeah. Yeah. This reminds me of the whole silencing dissent thing. I'm reminded of one of my heroes, a fellow I see at TAM, the Amazing Meeting, a fellow named Simon Singh, who made some comments about chiropractic. I think it was the British Chiropractic Association. And it really, his words were based on, please provide some evidence about some of the claims you're making. Yeah. And rather than doing what any, say, valid medical profession would do, or scientific organization would do, which is provide the evidence. Right, here you are. Here is the proof upon which we base our claims. They sued instead in the British libel courts, which are rather draconian. And
I think I put that on some skeptical blog.
Yeah, Skeptical Inquiry and all the various blogs have had Simon on talking about this, and they've made great progress. But that in itself is an indication of the validity of the position when, rather than enter into a discussion, questioning with confidence is the phrase I'm saying used today, question with confidence, that instead of entering into that in the positive nature of positive development, they decided to try to squash dissent. And it tells me very much so what the strength of their arguments are. That is indicative to me of what that means about their ability to enter into honest debate.
To the other side.
Right.
And the irony is lost on them. It's frustrating and incredible, and that sort of thing.
So one of the things you mentioned as we were talking here is something that you're writing now, and if it's all right with you, if we can talk a little bit about the concept, without going into the specifics of the article you're working on, and that is sutta thumping. I know a lot of us come from a background where we have a different religious tradition as our background, what we were born with, what we were raised with. And many have come to have a different practice, whether it's atheism or secular Buddhism or secular humanism or whatever, something different. And either they replace the Bible thumping or Torah thumping or whatever thumping with science thumping, and I can get a little bit behind that, but not too much, because it's changeable, so there's some value in that. But they replace it with something else, and that's one of the issues that we sometimes face is we have people who shall remain nameless, but we've talked about them before, say, well, your secular practice isn't valid because, and then they quote the Pali Canon. Even though we could also quote the Pali Canon and say, well, okay, here's the Kalama Sutta, we're just doing what Buddha said, so back off, Charlie.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? Because as someone who studies and reads the Pali as is, I imagine you may run into that a little bit more than the average bear.
Yeah. Yes. That's how I know about these sutta thumpers. I encounter them a lot. I say there are two things I could say. The first is my own experience. One of the reasons I think I've stuck with this tradition for so many years is that it provides a methodology and for the real work to happen. And the real work to me happens in meditation. And the more I sit in stillness and silence, the more things fall away from me. That the less and less capable I become of holding on to identity and to beliefs and notions. One of them being the identity or beliefs associated with Buddhism and meditation itself. So I become this, and then I can read a Pali text where the Buddha talks about putting down the burden and hanging up the raft.
Yeah.
and letting the collapsed house lie in tatters and not build it. And I can say, it seems to be talking about something that's happened to me in meditation. So I really appreciate the fact that there's a methodology there, which is lost in most other forms of religion and philosophy. They just have the ideas and the language and the arguments and the scriptures and so forth, but don't always have a practice.
Yeah, not the here's how to put that into your daily life, moment by moment.
Exactly. So that's one thing, is the practice of meditation itself seems to discharge and deflate an awful lot of that kind of belief, holding of beliefs and so forth. The other thing is, if you really start digging into these texts, it's not going to be pretty. There are so many things going on, and it's so obviously the case. Like I put in the basic teachings that these scriptures of whatever kind, Christian or Buddhist, are covered in the smudges of the ages. You know, people's fingerprints are all over them. There are suttas that. Here's my basic theory: is that the people who started compiling these texts and preserving these teachings had two basic concerns. One of them was to preserve what they saw as precious and valuable teachings. So that's one thing the Pali Canon contains. The other concern that they have, the other project of theirs was to win patrons and converts, to build the institution, to get land and build property and so forth. And so, to me, when I read the text, one way I start making a differentiation is between what is this text supporting here? Is it supporting the teachings or the institution? I mean, there are lots of ways you can divide it up. You can make lots of choices, and there are other ways I go about it. It's like there's a hermeneutics, the way of interpreting this stuff. But that's one basic distinction I make. And when I do that, I see that an awful lot of the texts in the canon really serve the interest of the institutions, especially the monks, winning the patronage. There's a lot of stuff in there that fits genres that readers or hearers in that day would have expected, like the stuff on the devas, the gods, and stuff about the supernatural power. These were elements of so-called religious texts or teachings that would have been expected. So it was incumbent on the tradition to meet this expectation in order to win converts. So that's one distinction. One thing that disturbs me about the so-called sutta thumpers or Buddhists in general in America or anywhere for that matter, but I'm really only concerned with Buddhism in America, is the refusal or the inability or whatever it is to start making these distinctions. It's like what we talked about earlier with science and religion. It's not all the same. There are real important differences, and maybe one thing that a book like this can serve is that it'll start developing some people who can start making some distinctions. Anyone who studied the Bible can't come away from it believing anymore that it's of the single piece, right? Lots of genres that were floating around, the Near East at the time, are showing up in the Bible. A lot of biblical texts are obviously an imitation of meeting these expectations, and the Pali Sutta is no different. It's just because if you get rid of the notion of an inspired religious text, a lot of that's out the window as well. I mean, I don't buy everything I read in Nietzsche either, or scientific texts. I read it with discernment and skepticism, and you do the same here.
Well, that's a very important distinction, is that as you were talking about the Bible, I have very dear friends who see the Bible as being absolutely perfect and inspired and wonderful, exactly the opposite of how I read it. And we're reading the same word, we got the same version and all that, and we go through it, and I will bring up specific passages that I have trouble with. They'll say, oh no, that's fine. I'll say, how? How is that not, do these not say completely different things that are in conflict? And I say, well, it's just okay, and there's very clearly a faith-based attachment to what this says, that it is continuous regardless of what your forebrain may be telling you. And I have a problem with that. I have a harder time just saying, okay, I try to pay more attention to cognitive dissonance. That's something that comes up in my meditation. I look at what's going on. And it shocks me that we can bring up things that are, at least to me, seemingly in conflict in the Pali. And people who would reject any such notion that, say, a Bible doesn't say things that are in conflict, are perfectly happy to dismiss any such conflict in the Pali canon, because it's our own practice, so it's okay. I don't think that is okay. I think we need to be able to question and put our own practice under the same scrutiny as we do others. Otherwise, we will be going down a path that may not be where we want it to go.
Yeah, and the point of this can't be to adhere to a system, the system of Buddhism or whatever. The point of it all should be, or as I understand it to be, is to clarify what it is to be a human being and how to live given the facts we discover in being a human being. The facts, for example, of tension, of that we have conflicting desires at any given instant, and all the world around us has conflicting desires at any given instant, and that creates a sort of constant, steady state of something like tension. And clarifying this is what's important, not upholding some sort of a system. What you described there with the, is, whether it's sutta thumpers or Bible thumpers, is where they can't permit a contradiction. They're trying to protect the system and keep a system in place. And there's this idea that if you start questioning that, the whole edifice will crumble somehow.
Right.
I don't see the Buddha's teachings as systematic either. If the guy really lived for 80 some years and taught for 45, I mean, were these teachings hatched and never full formed? The sutta actually has stories in there that makes it sound like they were, like under the tree of enlightenment, he had these cataclysmic events occur. But to me, again, it just reads like literature. Like, yeah, if I were trying to convince the public, I'd have a story like that too. And interestingly, everything in the actual teachings that are the point of the sutta contradicts that business, because it talks about impermanence and non-substantiality and change. So you have to make some decisions here. But the basic decision is not to try to preserve the system of Buddhism. Systems are only interested in systems, not with the messiness of human life.
Yeah, the truth carries forward whether it's one that we find convenient or not so convenient. And that's a different subject we won't get into in a cool book you told me about that I'm going to keep secret until some later date.
For now,
we can talk about it then. Yeah, we'll do another bit on that one. But the idea here that if we present to people a religious text, a scripture in quotes with big red Gothic lettering from another tradition, and we present something that we find to be a fantasy element, beautiful and inspiring, absolutely, but factually in error. That when we present that to someone who is, say, a sutta thumper, and we say, look, do you believe that practice? Well, no, I don't. I think that, or what that tradition is saying, no, I don't. Why not? Well, because it doesn't make any sense. It's not real. That's fantasy. Okay. So if you ask someone from that tradition, they say, well, I don't have any evidence. I just got to take it on faith. Will you? And they will, of course, say, well, no, absolutely not. Okay. So about this rebirth thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you take that on faith? Well, no. I had an experience in my meditation. I say, you know what? You did. I agree. Totally. Yes, you did have an experience in meditation. I believe that. I've had them too. However, we do understand that the brain can be fooled and is fooled on a regular basis. We can reproduce out-of-body experiences in the lab. And the idea that, but people who've died and have out-of-body, and they floated up and they could see things on the ceiling that were written there. No, they couldn't, actually. That is not correct. That is not true. The truth of it is that various hospitals who have done this sort of thing and written stuff up, and hey, if you have an out-of-body experience, there's something on the rafter up there, let us know what it says. None of them have been able to do there's an after-the-fact story that is changed to say that they could, much in the same way that, there's a story of, Darwin recanted and became a Christian on his deathbed. Nope, not true. Sorry, yeah. That's an old wives' tale. That's not so. So as we are willing to question the veracity of supernatural claims, or claims not in evidence from other traditions, it's still valid for us to do it with our own. We can only get stronger by that, because if it is something that really our practice depends on, that's where we have a problem. If our practice is dependent, and this is where, we can't get rid of rebirth, because the whole thing collapses then, as you said, is what I have been sometimes told about why I have to believe in the very tangible, real rebirth.
Yeah.
Well, not so. Actually, many of us are able to practice and setting aside the notion of rebirth. And we still see the positive effects in our lives today.
What do people think collapses when you give up that notion, like ethics and morality, or any motivation to do good? But there are people who do all kinds of good things without or ethical motivations or beliefs in afterlives or future consequences. I don't know where that. That's an untested assumption too.
It's the same argument that a religious right wing in this country uses against atheism, is that you have no moral compass. Atheists must all good moral behavior comes from God, their particular God. Of course, anyone else, any other religion, nope, that's not good enough. It has to be their God. And that is demonstrably not true. That is factually in error. And we have the same thing where, and this is an article you and I have spoken about before, where we see Buddhist religious figureheads associating secular Buddhist practice with Hitler, and oh my goodness, and that's how bad it is.
Good defense of that particular argument.
Yeah.
Good critique of it.
It's the same argument that we see within our own community.
Yeah, it's no different with Buddhists. This deep, Schopenhauer talked about the metaphysical need, that he said any thinking person can think his or her way to disbelief in God or supernatural agents or heavens or afterlives, but there still remains the metaphysical need, the deep apparently this pervasive need to have some sort of reassurance that it can't just end on death. There has to be some further and deeper meaning to all of this, and Nietzsche picked that up and worked with it, and I think the Buddha dealt with it too, and I think one way he might have dealt with it is he left that kind of alone for people. He left that alone, like he says in some suttas, like if there's an afterlife, then if you do this stuff, then you'll be in good shape. If there isn't one, then you'll be in good shape right here and now.
Yeah, you'll still be in good shape.
And again, if you're reading the Pali, you see that it's in this optative grammar. We're saying if it's the case, another point to be made there is, so why should people who become Buddhist not use Buddhism just as a way as a palliative, again, as a way to create an armor or a shield against what seem to be the real hard, biological, physical facts of human existence, whereby cessation, decay and cessation seems to be a real salient feature. Why should people coming to Buddhism be any different? They're not. They're looking to meditation. Buddhism is a way to somehow escape from life unscathed, to perpetuate the sense of self. No different. One way I deal with that is, again, I make a very basic distinction, and I don't mean to sound like I'm reductive or really simplistic, but I like to start with something very simple and see how complex I need to make it. And based on the topic you're bringing up here, the one distinction I make is simply between knowing and believing. We talked about this last time. The article we read, he made the point that if we have awareness of abstracting, if we know how to do this basic abstraction, we can then replace our believing with our thinking, or we can recognize believing as believing, knowing as knowing, thinking as thinking, and start seeing the difference. And I think what a lot of people do is they believe in things like rebirth, but they never really subject it to the question of whether this is some sort of knowledge I have, or I'm holding it as belief, and they just refuse to do this very, very basic work. That if they were making financial decisions or decisions about life and death, health issues, they'd be making. But when it comes to this stuff, somehow we allow ourselves to skimp a bit.
It's, that's perhaps as a topic for a different discussion, because I think we can go at length about it, is this idea between whether the Buddhist views of being a middle way between, there's that middle way term again that gets misused a lot, I think,
yes,
between eternalism,
right,
and nihilism.
Yes.
And at least, and this is my impression again, so I may be in error here, is that there's something of a mix here, that there's eternalism and being the idea that there's a self, and it continues on and on and on. And nihilism being that there's a self and it ends abruptly, right, and finally, and that's a depressing thing. Okay.
Yes.
And where in the suttas, and you will of course know this better than I will, is that the idea here with Buddhist teaching is no, neither of those. Those are both incorrect views. And yet, as we see at the end of, say, Buddha's life, and when an arahant passes away, that there is a complete extinguishing to no remainder. However the phrasing goes, that's it. And that seems to be a very nihilistic idea. That's our goal. That there is no return to the rounds of rebirth. That's it. And I've always looked at this as the reason why it is neither eternalism nor nihilism. With the not being eternalism, that one's pretty easy. That's it. There's an end, extinguishing, no remainder, no coming back. You're done. That's not eternalism. One would think that's nihilism, but the distinction that in my mind is that with nihilism starts with the premise of there is a self that ends. And to me, that's always been, and this may be completely wrong, so people don't listen to me, I don't know what I'm talking about, is that that starts with the premise of there is a self, and that's why that is not correct, because with Buddha's teaching, there is no self to be found, that there are skandhas, that is a process and their interactions and a constant rising and falling, but no self to end. Glenn, what are your thoughts on that kind of idea? Because you've been studying this longer and in more original texts, so you have a greater insight into this. I'd like to hear what you think of it.
I mean, that's a great question, and it's an interesting interpretation you have there. And if you think about it, it's saying that Gautama was even more radical than like a nihilist was to Gautama what the eternalists are to the nihilists. Not even the self to be annihilated. So, but I'm just going to throw this out there. I don't want to talk about it too much right now. I'm working on a piece I've been working on for about 2 years.
So it's a big question.
I'm actually exploring the argument that the Buddha was the nihilist. One thing I think is certain is most of the Buddhists I know, and there are an awful lot of the Buddhists in the canonical literature, are eternalists. It is not rebirth an eternalist notion? There's so much in there. Enlightened mind, original mind. There's so much in there that says this will never end.
Right.
The irony, of course,
thing. Yep.
What's that?
This is an eternal thing. Original mind. Well, that's first cause. Early Buddhism does not have a first cause.
And there's not even a beginning to it. It's something to explore. We don't have to decide the matter now, but certainly a lot of ideas in Dharmakaya Buddha, Tathagata Garbha, Chitta Rigpa, enlightened mind, cosmic Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the Buddha fields where you're reborn, for what seems to me, if it's not eternity, or infinity, or eternity, it's like it's quasi-eternity, or
it may as well be for all intents and purposes.
And I don't know why. Maybe part of the maturation of Buddhism in America is people starting to take a hard look at this. I wonder if, I think that the Buddha was a nihilist in the sense that he posited an actual end. And the irony is that was actually the goal of the Upanishads and a lot of the teachings around Buddha, that there was a great disgust with the notion of rebirth.
Right.
And of keeping it going somehow. The fire of consciousness was too much. It needed to be cooled and extinguished. That was the goal. But because we kept screwing up, we had to keep coming back. That was the idea. The more misery and pain. So Westerners loved the idea of rebirth. That's
right. That's part of the mysticism.
They loved it. And Buddha, if anything, the Buddha's like, part of this practice, you can end this cycle of rebirth. If that isn't nihilism in some basic sense, again, just like we have the Buddhist thumpers, we have the philosophical sticklers. There are a billion forms of nihilism, but I mean, in just a very general sense, there's something, just as you say, nihilistic about that. This piece I'm working on is asking the question about Gautama's nihilism. And one thing I'm wondering when I read the sutras is if the idea of the middle is kind of, in a sense, ironically introduced as a way to negotiate this difference between the teacher and his followers, who couldn't somehow, and certainly the people at the time of the Buddha couldn't abide by such a notion. But eternalism has always been a very popular and desired option. I mean, maybe that's not true. Maybe something like a rebirth in heaven is attractive.
Yeah.
The earth wasn't attractive. So eternalism is okay if you ended up in a good place. But it's a great question you're asking, and I hope people will start asking the question, look at it. The book I mentioned to you, one of the reasons it's a very valuable book is it's about this philosopher who is trying to rehabilitate, in a sense, the notion of nihilism is not such a terrible thing, but as an important sort of guide for our philosophizing and our thinking about the human.
Well, an important realistic proposition that can help honestly lend great value and meaning and reward to our lives. You don't need to focus on but then it ends, how depressing. Like, well, okay, please understand you're a Buddhist, you start with dukkha. So we know that it may sound not good from the get-go. Let's look at it. One of the reasons I'm curious to see where your research and studies take you on that issue in particular, is that anytime I encounter the not eternalism, not nihilism, is I don't see an explanation in there, because normally when we see passages and someone asks Buddha something, he goes into great depth and great detail on explaining the answer. It's not just a yes, no, and on to the next. You have to take it from me because I'm the Buddha. No, he explains why, so that the person understands and gains this ground and this visceral knowledge, so that they don't need to ask the question again. They got it. And I don't see that here. I keep seeing in the passages, it's neither this nor that, but not how it's neither this nor that, because if it's ending with no remainder, that's the part I'm confused by. And I have not found an explanation of why not that. So I'll be curious to hear from you at another time on that.
When I finish this piece, that'd be great if we could have a chat about that, either just privately or for the podcast, because I think it's a real important question.
Yeah, would love to. One of the things I did want to mention to people who are listening to the podcast is bear in mind, Glenn, I will speak for you on this because I think this is so. Both Glenn and I really love the Pali. We love the suttas. They are deeply inspiring, and some recent conversations I've had on the Facebook page for the podcast, to say that we have a secular approach, as many of us do, is not to say that our noses aren't in the Digha Nikaya and the Samyutta Nikaya and reading the canon on a regular basis, because it is. I'm not proposing that we not do that and not look at those and not read them or rewrite them. That's not it for me at all, because I find great inspiration and great meaning in there, and I can still set aside the things that are not in evidence. I am okay doing that because they're not in evidence, and they don't fit with some of the things like we were just talking about. So understand that when we say that there are folks who we would, from our perspective, view as Sutta thumpers, it's not to say that that's a wrong thing. It's to say that that's not our particular approach, and that we still do have a great admiration for the Pali Canon. You especially, Glenn, going out of your way to learn Pali and several other languages to round out that appreciation and study for it.
Well, and I think I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying, and I think the value in reading the Pali literature, in English too, is to let it be, have a conversation with it, let it, think with these teachings, think about our lives, and use these teachings to help us think through our lives, and not to find the answers, but as a partner in dialogue. I mean, the suttas are dialogical. We should bring this dialogical mind to our reading of them. We're asking questions about being a human being and how to live as well as we can. And the suttas are only valuable in that they help with that conversation and that investigation. And I don't mean to denigrate people who we're kind of joking about sutta thumpers. Maybe my criticism is that there has to be a limit to that kind of looking at the text and literature and the words, and as if it's like this secret map that we could just code somehow. But the people who really parse it, and I mean, I do that myself to a point, because I'm trying to figure out the meaning of things. It might take a word apart, look at the prefix and the stem and all that, but I guess it's a question of finding that it's like eating too much fruit. At some point you might get diarrhea. I mean, it's like the same thing here. At some point it might become unhealthy and counterproductive, and that's I don't mean to denigrate people who do that kind of work. I was trained as a philologist to do that kind of work. That's partly how I know about the dangers of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a difference between having a discussion about what is a material point that has meaningful impact to us, and versus how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
It is. It comes down to that sort of thing. Yeah. And at what point does it cease being a value, the investigation, and become just in and of itself an investigation of the thing? Like
right.
Is it Torah? What is it in the Jewish tradition where they really dig into the text, and at this point there's more commentary on the text than text itself? Like I forget what it is, or what is it? I can't remember, but it's kind of commentarial analysis. It has to be in the service of real lives and not in service of the text themselves.
Yeah, that's well put. Have it in service of real lives, not in service of the text. Beautifully put. Glenn Wallis, PhD in Buddhist Studies from Harvard University's Department of Sanskrit and Indian Studies. You can find Glenn on his website at www.glennwallis.com. That's GLENNWALLIS. Glenn, thank you so much for being here. It's great talking to you again.
Thanks so much, Ted. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.